Your grandmother's backyard fed her family for a week on 20 cents. Yours can't feed you for a day on $20. That's not a metaphor. That's arithmetic. In the 1930s, a 10-pound sack of potatoes cost less than 20 cents and could carry a family of 5 through 7 days of meals. Mashed, fried, boiled, baked, however you needed to stretch it. Today, we've forgotten that food can come from dirt instead of a delivery app. Now, before we go further, let's be honest about something. Not every family in the Great Depression had a backyard to dig into. Renters in tenement blocks, workers without an inch of land, people standing in bread lines in New York or Chicago. For them, a garden wasn't an option, and hunger was real, and it was brutal. We're not here to pretend the 1930s were some cozy, self-sufficient paradise. What we're here to show you is what the families who did have access to soil actually grew, the specific vegetables that stood between a household and starvation, and why that knowledge, once common as breathing, has almost completely disappeared from modern life. Because here's the part that should bother you. By 1933, nearly a quarter of American adults, 1 in 4 people who wanted work, couldn't find a job anywhere in the country. 15 million people. And when that many households lose their income at once, the ground under your feet stops being decoration. It becomes the only grocery store that never closes. So over the next few minutes, we're going to walk through 25 plants, the roots, the greens, the beans, the vines, that turned small backyard plots into survival machines. Some of these you'll recognize. Most of them, I'd bet, you've never planted, and maybe never even eaten. By the end, you're going to look at your own yard differently. Let's start where they started, underground. 1. The potato, the plant that refused to let you starve. If there was one crop a Depression-era family could not afford to skip, it was the potato. It grew in poor soil. It grew in small spaces. And, this is the part people forget, it grew underground. Hidden from the eyes of anyone who might come looking for something to take. Picture a mother in a row house in Ohio, no bigger a yard than a bedroom, digging up a hill of potatoes she'd planted from the eyes of last year's crop. She hadn't bought seed potatoes. She'd cut up the ones with sprouts and buried the pieces. That's not folklore. That's how households with almost nothing kept a pantry stocked. The math was brutal and beautiful at once. A 10-pound sack of potatoes ran under 20 cents through most of the 1930s, and that single sack could feed a family of 5 for an entire week of meals. Grown at home, the cost dropped to almost nothing but the seed and the labor. Compare that to today, where the average household throws away pounds of factory-bagged potatoes every month because they sprouted in the pantry before anyone got around to cooking them. The very sprouting that once meant free next crop now just means trash. There's a reason potatoes anchored so many of the era's most iconic frugal dishes. Potato soup made with nothing but a few tubers, an onion, milk, and butter, or potato pancakes grated from whatever was left over in the bin. Food historians point out that these weren't seen as sad, deprived meals at the time. They were simply what a competent household knew how to make when the wolf was at the door, and they tasted good enough to survive as comfort food generations after the hard times ended. If you plant nothing else this year, plant potatoes. A 5-gallon bucket with drainage holes and a few seed potatoes is enough to start relearning a skill your family once depended on to survive. 2. The sweet potato, the vegetable that fed the South through everything. In the American South, where soil ran sandy and summers ran brutal, the sweet potato did what almost nothing else could. It thrived where other crops gave up, and it stored for months without refrigeration nobody had anyway. Farm families would bank sweet potatoes in straw-insulated mounds or root cellars dug straight into a hillside, pulling them out through winter, the way we now reach into a freezer. A single harvest, properly stored, could stretch a family's food supply from October clear into spring. Agricultural extension records from the era consistently list the sweet potato among the highest yield, lowest effort crops a rural household could grow. Dense in calories, resistant to poor soil, and forgiving of a gardener who didn't have time to fuss over it. Now walk down a modern grocery aisle, and sweet potatoes show up as a seasonal side dish, maybe twice a year, wrapped in marketing about superfoods. Back then, it wasn't a trend. It was the difference between a full root cellar and an empty one. Even a few sweet potato slips in a large container can produce pounds of food from a plant most of us have reduced to a Thanksgiving garnish. Back then, it wasn't garnish. It was often the difference between a root cellar that carried a family to spring and one that ran empty by January. 3. The turnip. The vegetable nobody wanted until everybody needed it. The turnip carries a strange reputation. One generation's punchline is another generation's lifeline. In the 1930s, nobody was laughing. Turnips grew fast, tolerated frost, and gave a family 2 harvests from a single planting. The root itself and the leafy greens on top, both edible, both nutritious. A household could pull the greens for dinner, while the root kept swelling underground for later. Extension bulletins from the period routinely recommended turnips specifically because they matured in as little as 6 to 8 weeks, meaning a family that started the season with nothing could have food on the table before summer even peaked. Today, the turnip barely registers as a vegetable most people could identify, let alone cook. It's been pushed aside by crops that photograph better for a dinner plate, even though almost nothing grows faster or asks for less. A row of turnips planted in early spring can put both greens and roots on your table before most modern vegetables even sprout their first leaf. 4. The beet, the vegetable that gives twice. Most people think of the beet as a single thing, that dark root you boil and eat. Depression-era gardeners knew better. They planted beets not for 1 harvest, but for 2. The root you dug in fall, and the leafy greens you pulled all through the summer and early fall. A woman in Kansas could plant a single row of beets in spring and never buy a vegetable for months. Pull a young beet green for tonight's dinner, and the root keeps swelling underground. By October, you have both, the tender young leaves cooked down with onion, and a root that stores through winter in a cellar or buried in sand. Nutritionally, beets were a working vegetable, high in iron and folate, the exact minerals families eating cheap and simple diets couldn't afford to skip. You could boil the roots, pickle them for storage, or cook the greens down with a scrap of salt pork and onion. Same plant, 3 different meals. Agricultural records from the era show beets among the most commonly recommended crops for home relief gardens, because they did twice the work of almost anything else. Now we buy beetroot in vacuum-sealed plastic, already cooked, for the price of dinner out. The greens we throw away or never see them at all. In 1933, throwing away a beet green would have been the kind of waste that made a mother wince. That was protein, vitamins, and next week's salad. Plant a single square foot of beets this spring, and you'll understand immediately why they mattered so much. You'll be eating from that one patch for 5 months. 5. The carrot, the crop that lasted all winter underground. If the potato was reliability, the carrot was longevity. Carrots didn't just produce, they stayed. Produced, sitting in the ground or stored in cool, dark places, right through the cold months when almost nothing else remained. Plant them in early spring, and they'd feed you all summer and fall, and then keep feeding you through the winter, if you knew how to store them. Picture a root cellar, or a cold basement in Minnesota, early 1940s. Wooden crates lined with moist sand, carrots layered in carefully, one on top of another like they're in hibernation. A family could pull one or two as needed, through January, February, March. As long as the cellar stayed between 32 and 40 degrees, the carrots stayed firm and alive, losing almost nothing to rot or disease. Agricultural extension guides from the period consistently recommended carrots for storage life and nutritional reliability. Unlike greens that wilted or roots that rotted, carrots in cool sand lasted nearly as long as potatoes, sometimes longer, and needed almost no tending once they were underground and buried. Today, we buy carrots year-round from industrial farms thousands of miles away, in sealed bags, often already peeling from age before we use them. The idea of a single crop carrying a family through 4 months of winter is almost unthinkable to us now. Loosen the soil in a deep container and grow carrots with the expectation that they'll be feeding you into late fall. They'll surprise you with their patience and their sweetness once you've left them in the ground long enough to concentrate their flavor. 6. The rutabaga. The Depression vegetable that no one talks about, but everyone depended on. If there is a vegetable that defines Depression-era survival gardening, it's the rutabaga. It's not the most glamorous crop, and it never was, but it was steady, nourishing, and dependable, the kind of food that kept hope alive when almost everything else felt uncertain. A cross between a turnip and a cabbage, the rutabaga grows larger, stores longer, and tastes sweeter than its turnip cousin. In cool climates it thrives. In poor soil it persists. A single rutabaga can grow as wide as a fist and weigh several pounds, yet take up barely any space, which meant a small garden could produce enormous quantities of actual food. The most striking thing about the rutabaga is what it could do when stored properly. Lay them in boxes of sand in a cool place, a basement, a cellar, a buried bin, and they'll keep for months. Historical accounts from farming families describe pulling rutabagas from storage in March and April, still firm, still nutritious, when everything else had either frozen or rotted away. In modern kitchens, rutabagas barely exist. They're relegated to Eastern European restaurants or specialty farmers markets. Most people have never cooked one, let alone planted one. Yet it was the crop families trusted to see them through winter. Plant rutabagas in late summer for a fall harvest, and store them the way your grandmother might have, in sand, in a cool, dark place. You'll understand quickly why Depression-era families treated them like treasure. I know we're only 6 vegetables in, and already you're seeing a pattern. These aren't exotic crops, they're not trendy or Instagram-worthy. They're the opposite. They're humble, reliable, and absolutely forgotten. But there's something about that combination that kept families alive when nothing else would. Collard greens, the plant that sweetens in the cold. In the American South and in working-class neighborhoods of northern cities, collard greens anchored the garden. They looked almost delicate, broad, glossy leaves on a sturdy stalk, but they were practically indestructible. Plant them in spring, and they'd be ready to eat by early summer. Winter frost down to 10 degrees, collards got sweeter. You could pick the lower leaves all through the summer, and the plant kept producing new ones from the top. That's the real gift of collards, the never-ending factory. One plant, consistently harvested, could supply a family with greens from late spring until the first hard freeze, often spanning 5 or 6 months. Extension records from the era list collards among the highest nutrition, highest yield greens a household could grow. Rich in vitamins A, C, and K, they provided the exact micronutrients families living on beans and bread couldn't afford to miss. The flavor, slightly bitter, hearty, paired naturally with the meat scraps and salt pork that seasoned Depression-era cooking. Today, collard greens show up on Southern restaurant menus as a nostalgic side dish, something your grandmother's grandmother made, now with an air of rusticity attached to it. We've turned necessity into sentiment, but the truth is simpler. Collards fed more people, more reliably than almost any other crop a poor family could plant. If you have even a small amount of space, plant collards in early spring. They'll be feeding you by June, and won't stop until the deep cold arrives. C8. Cabbage, the vegetable that lived for 6 months. A single head of cabbage, properly grown, properly stored, could feed a family for weeks if someone knew how to preserve it. Raw, it was breakfast salad. Cooked, it was the foundation for supper. Fermented as sauerkraut, it became food that lasted through winter. And the fermentation itself provided probiotics families didn't have a word for, but definitely needed. The variety Danish ballhead dominated Depression-era gardens, producing tight heads up to 10 inches wide that packed enormous amounts of food into small spaces. But the real genius of cabbage was storage. A single head, kept in a root cellar or basement at cool temperatures, would sit for 6 to 8 months without rotting. Not just surviving, thriving, getting crisper as the months passed. Agricultural extension bulletins from the period pushed cabbage specifically because of this storage capacity. A harvest in October became food into April. Farmers could grow the heads and then harvest cabbage sprouts, small secondary heads that emerged from the cut stems, for spring greens. Nothing was wasted. Now we buy pre-cut cabbage in plastic and throw away half when it goes soft in the crisper. The idea that cabbage once meant independence, that a single crop could carry a family's nutrition for 2 seasons, feels almost fictional to us. Plant cabbage in spring and late summer, and store the heads as your great-grandparents did, in a cool, dark place. You'll see immediately why this vegetable was treated like an investment. 9. Swiss chard, the green that outdoes everything else. Here's what you need to know about Swiss chard. The more you harvested it, the more it produced. Cut and come again, gardeners called it. A single plant, tended properly, could feed a household for months. Pick small leaves for salads in early summer, let them grow bigger for cooking, and the plant just kept unfurling new leaves from the center. While every other green wilted and bolted the moment summer heat arrived, chard stayed sweet and productive. In 1933 or 1943, when you couldn't afford to miss a single harvest, that reliability was everything. A few plants placed near the kitchen door meant a family could grab a handful of leaves every single day, from late spring through the first frost. Chard stores the kind of vitamins your body needs when everything else in your diet is carbohydrates and cheap protein. Vitamins A and C, minerals city families often ran short on. Plant it, and it becomes less like a vegetable and more like a financial instrument. Steady income in calories and nutrition. The magic of chard is that it actually improves with regular harvesting. The more stress you put on it by picking, the more aggressively it grows. In a Depression-era garden, that wasn't a coincidence. That was survival engineering. It's almost as if the plant was designed specifically for families who needed constant, unpredictable harvests. Pull leaves whenever hunger arrived, and the plant simply responded by making more. Plant chard in spring, and it will feed you until cold kills it down. Then plant it again in late summer for a fall and early winter harvest. You're looking at 9 months of constant, fresh greens from one initial planting. That is an astonishing return on a single seed packet. By now, you're noticing something. The vegetables that mattered most weren't exotic. They weren't rare. They were the greens and roots that thrive in poor soil, that store for months, that keep producing if you know how to harvest them. The kind of plants that ask almost nothing and give everything. 10. Spinach, the green that asked for almost nothing. Spinach loves cool weather. Plant it in early spring, and it will reward you with tender, nutritious leaves faster than almost any other green. But the real secret to spinach in Depression-era gardens was understanding the seasons. Sow in spring, harvest through early summer, then sow again in late summer for a fall crop when the cool weather returns. Most families would have had spinach on their table from April through June, and then again from September through November. Unlike lettuce, which bolts and becomes bitter the moment heat arrives, spinach had a strategy: plant it when it wanted to grow. This was practical wisdom. A family that couldn't afford to experiment or fail needed crops that worked with the seasons instead of against them. Spinach provided minerals and vitamins most poor households ran dangerously low on: manganese, calcium, folate, potassium. A small patch, planted twice a year, meant a consistent source of food that needed almost no tending and took up almost no space. Today, we buy baby spinach in plastic clamshells, most of it picked weeks ago, and it's still somehow expensive. The idea that a household could grow spinach so easily, twice a year, feels like a luxury rather than what it was: basic agriculture. Plant spinach seeds directly into soil in early spring and again in late August. Thin the seedlings and eat the tender thinnings as microgreens. Let the rest mature. That's efficiency. 11. Mustard greens, the vegetable with a bite. Where collards were gentle and persistent, mustard greens had personality. They came with a peppery, almost spicy kick that livened up the simple broths and stews Depression-era cooking required. But more than flavor, they were resilience in leaf form. Mustard greens thrived in cooler weather and could be harvested continuously if you picked the outer leaves and let the center keep growing. The same cut-and-come-again principle that made collards so valuable. A single patch, planted in spring and again in late summer, could supply fresh greens from May through November in most climates. Nutritionally, mustard greens packed the same vitamins A, C, and K that families needed but couldn't easily get from beans and bread. Agricultural records from the era list them among the most efficient crops per square foot of garden space. The bitterness that some people dislike was actually an advantage in Depression kitchens. A handful of mustard greens, cooked with a scrap of salt pork or bacon fat, transformed a pot of beans or a thin soup into something with actual flavor and character. You needed very little of it to change an entire meal. Now mustard greens show up on trendy restaurant menus as a bold or spicy side, priced accordingly. We've turned efficiency into sophistication. Plant mustard greens in cool seasons and prepare to be impressed by how aggressively they produce. 12. Dandelion greens. When you harvested what grew for free. This is where the garden stops being a planned thing and starts being pure survival. Dandelions don't get planted. They show up uninvited in almost every yard in America. During the Depression, when families were desperate and growing everything they could in every scrap of soil, dandelions weren't treated as weeds. They were treated as a crop that was already doing half the work for you. The young leaves, harvested in early spring, were slightly bitter and completely nutritious, packed with vitamins A, C, and K, plus iron and calcium. People would harvest them right from their own yards or from the abandoned lots and roadsides of their neighborhoods, where they grew in abundance without any effort at all. The roots were roasted and ground as a substitute for coffee, stretching that luxury into something affordable during times when even coffee felt like an impossible dream. But let's be clear about what dandelion greens represented. This wasn't farming anymore. This was scrounging. This was the option families used when they had nowhere else to turn. If you had any other vegetable growing, you picked that first. Dandelions were the backup, the safety net, the proof that even in the worst circumstances, when everything else failed or ran out, the earth would provide something to eat for free. By the standards of modern gardening, wild harvested greens are trendy now. We call it foraging. We pay good money for artisanal dandelion salads in restaurants. But in 1933, harvesting dandelions from your yard meant your garden wasn't producing enough, or you were so poor you couldn't afford to wait for planted crops to mature. It was necessity, wearing the face of abundance. Notice what's happened. We've moved from the crops you deliberately planted and tended, potatoes, cabbage, collards, to crops that required increasingly less intervention. The mustard and spinach still needed planning. The dandelions needed nothing but a knife and a hunger. By the end of this list, you're going to see plants that ask even less and give even more. 13. Cowpeas, black-eyed peas, the bean that loved heat and gave protein. If there was ever a crop designed for people with almost nothing, it was the cowpea. Hardy in heat, tolerant of drought, thriving in poor soil that made other vegetables quit, cowpeas, especially the black-eyed pea variety, did what almost nothing else could. Plant them after the last frost in warm soil, and they'd push through the summer when everything else was struggling. By August, you'd have pods drying right on the plant. No special equipment, no effort beyond letting nature finish the job. Pick them when young for fresh eating, or leave them to mature dry and store them for winter. The nutritional profile is almost absurd. 23% protein in the dried bean. Iron, folate, fiber. The exact nutrients a household living on cornbread and salt pork couldn't afford to miss. The protein in cowpeas complements grain protein perfectly. A bowl of cowpeas with cornbread or rice becomes a complete protein, which is why Depression-era cooks instinctively paired them. Beyond nutrition, cowpeas did something most crops couldn't. They improved the soil while growing. A legume family member, cowpeas partnered with soil bacteria to fix nitrogen from the air, which meant next year's garden would be more fertile. You fed your family this year and made your soil richer for next year. Double utility. Today, black-eyed peas show up as a southern delicacy, served on New Year's Day for luck. We've turned emergency food into tradition. Plant cowpeas in warm soil after the last frost, and let them dry on the vine. Shell them dry and store in sealed jars. They'll be edible for years. 14. Common beans, navy, pinto, and Great Northern, the backbone crop. If cowpeas were the heat-loving southern choice, the common beans, navy, pinto, Great Northern, were the backbone that held Depression-era protein together across the entire country. These were the beans that became bean soup, baked beans, the filling for nearly every stretch-the-meal dish a cook needed. The strategy was straightforward. Plant them late, after spring crops, so they'd mature in the dry fall weather. Let them stay on the plant as long as possible, until the pods turned brown and the beans inside rattled when you shook them. Then harvest, shell, and store them in sealed jars in a dry place. Navy beans, in particular, were practically foolproof. A family with one row had protein for the winter. Agricultural records from the era list them as the cheapest source of complete nutrition a household could grow themselves. But the real miracle was storage. Properly dried beans in sealed containers would last for years, Not just last. They'd maintain their viability as seed for the next year's planting. That meant a single successful harvest could fund 2 seasons of planting, or it could feed 2 winters from 1 year's work. Modern cooking has made beans trendy, artisanal, hand-selected varieties, cooked low and slow. But for Depression-era families, beans were arithmetic, pure, essential arithmetic. Plant common beans in late spring or early summer, let them dry completely on the plant, then store them in sealed containers. 1 row can feed a person for months. 15. Peas for drying, the crop you could harvest twice. In the north, where cowpeas struggled in cool weather, field peas, the kind you let dry on the vine rather than harvest green, were the answer. Sow them early in spring for a first crop, harvest and dry them in early summer, then sow again in midsummer for a fall harvest. The most productive varieties were the southern peas, like pink-eyed purple hulls. You could pick them fresh when the pods were still soft, or you could leave them on the plant and watch them dry right there. A single plant, if trellised up, could produce for months. Kids would go out in the morning to harvest overnight beans. That's not poetry. That's historical testimony from people who lived it. Dried peas, unlike beans, don't require soaking before cooking. Drop them straight into a pot of broth and they're ready to go. They were the foundation of split pea soup, which fed families through winter. Just peas, an onion, a ham bone if you had one, and salt. That's dinner. That's survival. Here's the thing about peas. They fix nitrogen like beans do, but they also mature faster. In cool season climates, you got 2 full cycles from 1 year. 2 harvests, 2 windows to preserve food. That's design efficiency that modern agriculture has mostly forgotten. Dried peas store for a decade in sealed containers. A single packet of seed becomes multiple years of food and soil improvement. Plant peas in early spring, in cool climates, and again in late summer. Let them dry completely on the vine, then shell and store them dry. No freezing, no canning, just a sealed jar in a dark pantry. Look at what's happened over these last few items. We've moved from individual vegetables to entire protein systems. Potatoes alone can't feed a family all year. Greens alone won't sustain. But potatoes, beans, peas, and grains together, that's a complete diet. That's survival architecture. Depression-era gardeners didn't plant randomly. They planted with math. 16. Lentils, the legume that didn't demand soaking. While beans dominated protein stores, lentils provided something different and more practical for many households. They cooked faster. They didn't require the overnight soaking that navy beans and pintos demanded. You could throw dried lentils into a pot of broth in the evening and have a complete dinner ready in an hour. A significant advantage when fuel was scarce and families needed to minimize the time spent over a hot stove. Nutritionally, lentils rivaled beans entirely, high in fiber, protein, folate, and iron. Rich in complex carbohydrates, they provided sustained energy, the kind of meal that kept a working body going from dawn until dark. Depression-era Usta radio shows like Aunt Sammy promoted lentil-based recipes, specifically to help struggling families eat nutritious meals on nearly nothing but dried legumes and water. Lentils fix nitrogen like other legumes, improving soil fertility. They stored for years in sealed jars in a dry pantry. Properly dried lentils maintain their protein and mineral content indefinitely, which made them ideal for a household that needed to trust its stored food. The real magic of lentils was simplicity. A handful of dried lentils, an onion, salt, and water becomes split pea soup, or in this case, lentil soup. That was dinner. That was poverty, made edible and nutritious. Today, Lentils show up on restaurant menus as a trendy superfood, priced like luxury. But they were the workhorse legume of Depression kitchens, because they asked for almost nothing in return for almost everything a body needed. Plant lentils in cool season climates and let them dry completely on the vine. Shell and store in airtight containers for years. 17. Winter squash, the vegetable that fed through winter. If there was a single crop that allowed a Depression-era family to imagine eating something besides potatoes and beans through January and February, it was winter squash. It was the difference between monotony and actual diversity of food. Plant in spring, grow through summer, harvest in fall before the first frost, then store it, actually store it, not can it, not preserve it, in a cool, dry place, and it kept. A butternut squash harvested in October could still be feeding a family well into January, 2 to 3 months of eating. A Hubbard squash could last until late spring, into April or May if stored right. That's 6 months of meals from a single planting. Butternut, Hubbard, and Boston marrow were the variety's Depression-era gardeners, planted because they stored reliably. The flesh was dense and sweet, versatile enough for soup, for roasting, for mashing, for stretching a meal that had already been stretched thin. A single squash yielded multiple servings and weeks of meals. A single harvest yielded food through the entire winter. The preparation was simple. Cure them for 10 to 20 days at room temperature to harden the skin, then store them in a cool, dry place. No special equipment, no canning knowledge required, just patience and a place to put them. Modern gardeners have largely forgotten winter squash as a storage crop. We buy them individual at the market when we want them. But for families who needed meals to stretch from September through April, a row of winter squash was the difference between monotony and survival. Plant winter squash in spring, harvest in fall, cure for 2 weeks, then store in a cool place. One plant provides meals for months. Zucchini, the summer abundance. Zucchini is different from winter squash. It's tender, fast-growing, prolific in a way that borders on the absurd. Plant a few seeds in late spring, and by early summer you're drowning in them. Kids in Depression-era gardens would go out in the morning and come back with armfuls. But zucchini doesn't store. It's a summer crop. Fresh, fast, abundant, and gone by fall. So what was its purpose in a Depression garden, where storage was everything? Simple. It was food right now. Summer food. Food that didn't require waiting. And while it was here, you could eat it fresh. You could grate it into breads to stretch flour. You could fry it. You could dry strips of it for winter if you had a way to do that. Some families did, making something like vegetable jerky. But mostly, zucchini was the exception to the Depression-era rule of preservation. It was the vegetable that said, for one season, you don't have to make do. You have abundance. In that context, zucchini was almost a luxury. By now, you've seen something important. The Depression-era garden wasn't built around variety, or flavor, or consumer choice. It was built around redundancy. Multiple crops that stored. Multiple crops that provided protein. Multiple crops that improved soil. Potatoes for carbs, beans and peas for protein, greens for vitamins, squash for calories, roots for storage. No single crop mattered. The system mattered. We've made it through the vegetables. Now comes the harder part. The crops that asked for more skill and gave more back. 19. Corn, the grain that started as fuel. Corn was not primarily about eating fresh off the cob for Depression-era families. Sweet corn was a luxury, reserved for eating seasons when it was ready. The corn that mattered was dent corn, field corn with hard starch around the edges and soft starch in the center that shrunk as it dried, creating the characteristic dent on each kernel. This was the corn that kept through winter. Dent corn could be harvested completely dry and stored for years. Shelled and dried, it was ground into cornmeal for bread. Cooked with lime water, it became hominy, which could be further processed into nixtamal and masa. The kernels themselves could be popped for eating. The cobs burned hot in stoves. Nothing wasted. A single plot of dent corn provided calories for months. High in starch, rich in carotene, vitamin A, in a form a body could use and absorb. Families who had space planted it alongside beans, using the corn stalks as living trellises that the beans would climb. The Three Sisters system: corn, beans, squash, providing protein, carbohydrates, and calories, all from interwoven plantings. Dent corn heirloom varieties, grown in home gardens across Appalachia and the Midwest, were selected specifically for this dual purpose. Eat fresh in the milk stage if you wanted, or let them dry for storage and grinding. Today we distinguish sharply between sweet corn, the kind you buy at a farmer's market, and field corn, which we mostly feed to animals. But that distinction is modern. For depression families, the line was thinner. You ate fresh when you could. You dried the rest. Plant dent corn in spring and harvest in fall. Dry the ears completely and store them whole, or shell and store the kernels in sealed containers for years. 20. Oats and barley, the grains for hearty porridge. If corn was fuel, oats and barley were the grains that filled you up and kept you warm. A bowl of oatmeal made from oats you grew yourself required nothing but boiling water. Barley went into soups and broths that stretched meat scraps into meals. Both grains could be grown in surprisingly small spaces, even intercropped between vegetable rows. Barley especially thrives in cool weather and grows quickly, maturing within a single season. Oats take slightly longer and prefer consistent moisture, but they grow well in most temperate climates. The difficulty with home grain production was processing, threshing, winnowing. Separating the grain from the chaff required knowledge and tools. It was work. Most home gardeners who grew oats and barley did so in larger country plots rather than tiny city backyards. But families with enough land planted them because they stored indefinitely, provided bulk calories, and improved soil fertility through their deep root systems that pulled nutrients from deep below the surface. Historically, oats and barley showed up more on farms than in urban depression gardens. But in rural areas, with even modest land, a quarter-acre plot or more, they were standard. The grain went to the family's table, not just to animal feed. If you have space and patience for processing, plant oats or barley in early spring. They'll be ready to harvest by late summer. Now we're past the vegetables and into the serious grains. These are the crops that took skill and space. These are the ones that required knowledge most gardeners today have forgotten. How to thresh, how to winnow, how to know when grain was dry enough to store. The next crops are different still. Some are about flavor, some are about stretch, and some are barely crops at all. With 21. Onions, the flavor that stored for months. If beans were protein and potatoes were carbohydrates, onions were the difference between eating and surviving. A single onion could transform a pot of beans into something you wanted to eat instead of something you had to eat. Onions store remarkably well. Properly cured and stored in a cool, dry place, they'll last from harvest in summer right through winter into February or March. Unlike fresh greens that wilt and spoil, unlike tomatoes that rot, Onions just sit there, getting sweeter as they age, waiting. The Depression-era trick was multiplier onions, varieties like Egyptian tree onions that didn't produce single large bulbs, but rather clusters of smaller bulbs. Plant once, and the bulbs would increase. Divide them, replant them each season, and you'd have more onions the next year. That's food security engineered into the plant itself. You didn't need to buy seed or sets every year if you understood multiplication. Onions also gave you green onion tops for much of the growing season, before bulbing started. A hint of flavor and freshness in an otherwise monotonous diet of stored roots and beans. Before the bulb swelled, you had greens to eat. After harvest, you had storage bulbs. Modern kitchens take onions for granted. We buy them year-round, pay almost nothing, and forget they were once a luxury, something a household grew, cured carefully, and rationed through winter. Plant onion sets or seeds in spring, harvest in late summer, cure for 2 to 3 weeks, and store in a cool, dry place. Properly stored onions last through winter. 22. Garlic. The medicinal spice. Garlic was medicine and food at once. A clove of garlic could flavor a pot of broth. A bowl of garlic soup could restore a family member who was sick. It was free medicine growing in the garden. Plant garlic in fall, harvest in late spring, cure for several weeks, and it stores for months, sometimes half a year or longer if kept cool and dry. A single harvest meant garlic through the following winter. Like onions, garlic produced something useful, even before the bulb matured. The green garlic tops in spring were edible and flavorful, giving families an early season ingredient, just as storage crops were running low. The irony is that garlic is almost free to grow. A few cloves planted in fall become multiple cloves by next summer. Divide them, replant them, and you're never without garlic. But it requires patience and knowledge. Understanding seasons, understanding storage, understanding that some crops demand seasonal work and reward you for it. Today, garlic shows up on every restaurant menu, imported from distant countries, sold year-round as if it were a fresh vegetable. We've made garlic so accessible that we've forgotten it was ever precious. Plant garlic cloves in fall, harvest in late spring or early summer, cure, and store in a cool, dry place. One harvest feeds a family for an entire year. 23. Stinging nettles, when nothing else was available. This is the final descending step into pure forage. Stinging nettles grow wild nearly everywhere. They have no value as a crop. They're not planted. They're not tended. They just show up. And during the Depression, when a family had eaten through their stored potatoes, when the greens had bolted, when winter was stretching thin, stinging nettles, free, abundant, packed with iron, calcium, vitamins A and C, became food. You harvested them wearing gloves, plunged them into boiling water for a minute to neutralize the sting, and suddenly you had soup, nettle soup. The leaves cooked down like spinach, tender and mild, once the sting was gone. The taste was clean and green and alive. Nettles represented the absolute floor of food security. If you had nothing else, nettles were growing in the ditch, free, nutritious, available at the moment you were most desperate. During spring and early summer, when gardens were just producing and fresh greens were becoming available, but storage crops were nearly exhausted, nettles bridged the critical gap. They were the insurance policy, the backup plan when calculations failed and the stored food ran short. Today we call this foraging and pay for classes about it. Restaurants charge for nettle soup. But in 1933 or 1934, nettles meant something simpler and more urgent. You wouldn't starve as long as weeds grew. If you live anywhere temperate, nettles probably grow near you. Find them in spring wearing gloves, boil them briefly, and taste what Depression-era families ate when the stored food ran out. We've gone from planned crops that required knowledge, potatoes, beans, corn, through the crops that required skill and patience, grains, onions, garlic, and now to the crops that required nothing at all except desperation and gloves. And we're almost at the end. Just a few more items. A couple of fruits. A final push. 24. Tomatoes. The crop that demanded work. Tomatoes were different from most Depression-era vegetables. They didn't store raw. You couldn't pull a tomato in October and eat it fresh in January. They required work. Intensive, hot, careful work. Canning, specifically. If you didn't know how to can, a glut of tomatoes in August was just rotting fruit by September. Wasted nutrition, wasted money. But families who knew how to can, and most did, because they had to, turned tomato harvests into the foundation of winter cooking and comfort. Rows of glass jars filled with canned tomatoes, tomato sauce, tomato sauce, tomato sauce, sat on root cellar shelves through the long months like stored light. A jar of tomatoes was comfort. It was flavor. It was a family saying to itself, "We planned ahead. We will eat well when snow comes and nothing grows." Mothers canned hundreds of jars each year, sometimes more than 1,000 in a season if the harvest was abundant. Boiling water poured over the tomatoes to slip the skins, the fruit packed into glass jars by hand, the jars sealed in a boiling water bath until you heard that sacred pop of the lid sealing itself. That sound meant the tomatoes wouldn't spoil. That sound meant bacteria couldn't grow. That sound meant your family would eat well when winter came. The variety that mattered was paste tomato, meaty, fewer seeds, denser flesh, Roma, San Marzano. They cooked down fast and yielded thick sauce instead of watery juice. Today, we buy canned tomatoes imported from Italy. We've forgotten that American families once canned more tomatoes than Italy grew. Plant paste tomatoes in spring, harvest in late summer, and can them while they're fresh. One plant can yield dozens of jars. 25. Rhubarb, the perennial that taught patience. The last plant on this list is also the first one that tells you Depression-era gardeners understood time differently than we do. Rhubarb is a perennial. Plant it once, and it comes back every spring for 10 years or more, growing bigger each year, requiring almost nothing but a sunny spot and patience. In early spring, when the ground is barely thawed and nothing else is producing, rhubarb pushes through, with edible stalks, ready to harvest before Easter. For cold climate families especially, Midwest, Northeast, Northern Plains, rhubarb was the first fresh food of the year after a winter of stored roots and canned goods. The tangy, tart stalks made rhubarb pie and rhubarb sauce and rhubarb jam. The plant asked for almost nothing and gave every spring like clockwork. Rhubarb is regional. It grows well in temperate climates, zones 3 to 8, thriving where winters are cold and springs arrive suddenly. In the south, or in truly warm regions, it struggles. But where it thrives, it's practically immortal. A single rhubarb plant, undisturbed for decades, keeps producing. This is what impressed me most about Depression-era gardening. They understood that not every plant needs to feed you this year. Some plants feed you next year, and the year after that. Some plants are investments in time. Plant a rhubarb crown in fall or early spring, in a permanent spot where it won't be disturbed. Then wait. Every spring after, you'll harvest food from a plant that cost you almost nothing to maintain. And here's where we've arrived. 25 plants, each one a small lesson in self-sufficiency. The Depression wasn't romantic. Hunger was real for millions. But for the families who had access to even a small patch of soil, these 25 plants were the difference between crisis and survival, between desperation and dignity. We've forgotten how to grow most of them. We've replaced the work of cultivation with the convenience of delivery, and in that trade, we lost something. Not just the food, but the knowledge, the skill, the proof that a family could feed itself. Maybe it's time to remember. If you've watched this entire video and thought, I could try growing one of these, that's enough. Start with the easiest one. Potatoes, beans, tomatoes. It doesn't matter which. Plant something and harvest something. Taste what it means to feed yourself, even just a little. And if this video spoke to you, if you felt that hollow in your chest when you realized how much we've lost, if this is the moment you decide to care about your own food security, then please, like this video and subscribe to the channel. We're going to keep walking backward through time, finding the skills our grandparents took for granted, and showing you they're still available, they're still possible, you're still capable. In our last episode, we showed you the money tricks that banks worked on Depression families, how financial institutions used fear and desperation to move money from working people into their vaults. The contrast is haunting. Families who couldn't afford to buy food were being sold financial products they didn't understand. Today's system is more sophisticated, but runs on the same principle. So if you haven't seen 25 Great Depression money tricks banks hoped you'd forget, go back and watch it. Then come back here and plant a tomato. One doesn't exclude the other. Which of these vegetables does your family still grow? Or did your grandparents grow? Tell me in the comments. Because I promise you, someone watching this needs to know that what their great-grandmother did wasn't quaint or nostalgic. It was survival. It was power. And it's still available to you. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.